Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Danny. I'm an illustrator specialising in pictures for children, and I especially draw a lot of animals. Now I've got quite a long video for you today because this is one that was originally made for my patrons, and it shows my entire Procreate illustration process in more or less real time. So you can see my thought processes and the decisions that I was making as I worked on this drawing. So you might want to make yourself a cup of tea, pull out your iPad or sketchbook and draw along with me for a while. So Procreate is a great app for sketching in. I use it if I am doing a sort of complex composition, if there's a lot of characters interacting on the page or something like that, then I'll use Procreate because it's so easy to move elements around and resize them and so on. But when it comes to sketching individual animals, I really enjoy using good old pencil in my sketchbook. So I've just used the iPad's built-in camera to snap a photo of my sketchbook page, and I'm going to import that into Procreate. So on a new document, which is A4 and it's 300 dpi, I'm going to add that image, insert photo, and there it is. And I want to draw this sort of slightly chonky looking Labrador at the bottom of the page, but I'm going to flip it over. Now flipping your drawings over like this is quite a good thing to do anyway, regardless of how, which way you want it to face in the end, because it allows you to see any errors. Sometimes you'll draw something one way and it looks good, and it's only when you flip it over that you realise something is off, something is just kind of distorted and is all sort of skewed. Flipping it over makes it really obvious what the problem is. So it's, if you're working digitally, that's quite a good thing to do anyway, just to look at your drawing. Okay, I'm gonna resize it, and I'm also just gonna hit distort down here. And why isn't that working? There we go, and just stretch it up slightly because I think he was looking a bit squat. So I'm just going to pull it up, I think, to about there, and just resize it again because it actually doesn't need to be that big. Okay, I think that works quite well. And then I'm going to lower the opacity of that layer so it's barely visible and create a new layer above. And then I'm going to use the 6B pencil, which comes with Procreate. It's in the sketching pack, but here I've made my own little folder called Pencil Pack, and it's got all my sort of most used graphite sort of brushes. So I've also got a copy of it in there. And I'm not going to use black, that's too harsh. I'm going to go with a dark grey. Bring the size down. And then I'm just going to go over the sketch that I've made. Now, because I was happy with that initial sketch, I don't think I need to make too many changes, or nothing significant anyway. I'm going to really take my time going over it here, because I don't need to do another sort of sketch layer. These lines that I'm making now might stay in the final image, or probably will stay. Now when I draw on the iPad, the little tappy noises that the pencil makes doesn't really bother me at the time that I'm drawing, but when I come to edit, it drives me insane. I have really, really severe misophonia. I spend most of my life in earplugs just to sort of get through the day. A lot of sound sensitivities. And this little tappy noise, I'm really, really hoping the microphone doesn't pick it up, because it's going to make the whole video unbearable for me. So I really hope that it's not bothering you. Okay, so the pencil is set very small. It's maybe a bit too narrow. I perhaps could have gone slightly wider, but I've started now, so I'm just going to carry on. See what it looks like. I can always come back and alter it afterwards. Sometimes I like working with a fatter, more sort of textured pencil line, and sometimes I like to work with a really fine pencil line like this and build up lots of little strokes instead. But most of the time I'm just sort of making it up as I go along, and if I'm not happy with that pencil line layer, I can just delete it and redo it without destroying the whole picture, which is the beauty of working digitally. Okay, let's add a little bit more detail in these eyes. No, I'm going to make this a bit larger. So I want to give her kind of side eyes, slightly sort of, I don't know, she's got no time for whatever's going on over there. What everyone's laughing about. I can't get this eye to match the first eye that I drew, so I've turned the canvas over because that will allow me to see both eyes at the same time and try and get the pupils looking in the same direction so she doesn't appear cross-eyed. I think that works. Okay, I'm going back and forth quite a lot here, deleting and then drawing them in again, but the eyes are the most important part of the dog, so I want to get them right, and I want to get them right at this stage so I don't have to worry about them afterwards. It's easier to get everything right at this point than be making changes later on. Okay, I think they're okay. So while I'm going over this sketch, you'll notice I'm not doing sort of continuous sweeping lines like this. I'm doing really short, broken lines, sort of building up that fur texture basically, particularly on areas like where there's corners, where there's joints, like on the corner of the ear here, on the chest here. If you ever look closely at a dog, the fur, you have fur growing in this direction and fur lying in that direction, and they kind of meet in the middle here and form a little ridge usually on the dog's chest. And here I'm trying to create a kind of roll of flesh or fur to add to the impression that this is quite a fat Labrador. My memory of this particular Labrador, Belle, is that she was overweight, and knowing my Nana, who was an animal lover, but I think she was probably a bit of a feeder as well. I think her pets probably got a few too many treats, and Labradors in particular I think tend to put on weight as they get older if you're not careful. So I remember her being a big girl. Okay, and when I do these hairlines, I'm thinking about the way the fur would lie on her body. So at the front of the leg here, the hair would be growing in this direction, and so we don't see so many of the individual hairs sticking out at the front because they're sort of lying flat there. Where we see them is here on the back of the leg, because that's the direction that they're lying in. Does that make sense? So on the front of the leg I do have more of a solid line. Under the belly the hairs would be shorter, so again not so many little lines going on there. And also, as I'm putting in these details, I'm trying to think of the dog as a 3D object, not a flat image on the page. So I'm following the contours of her body to add to the idea that she's round. Now, let's put that foot in there and then would that foot be sticking out? Where would it come to? Well, would it stick out to there? I don't think it would. I'm going to leave it like that. Okay, and I'm not going to draw a tail in. I'm just going to pretend that her tail is sort of around the other side of her body, out of sight, because if I were to draw a tail in over here, it would, I mean, it doesn't look that bad, but I think it would break up the overall roundness of the dog, and I quite like it just as it is. So if I go back to the layers and I hide that initial sketch from the sketchbook and have a look at what I've got, that's not too bad. Maybe these feet need to become a bit flatter so that they look a bit more grounded. So I just tidy those up a bit. And I think that's okay. It's a very thin outline. Maybe I should have used a heavier line, but that's okay because I'm going to go in at the end and tweak all of this line work. The next step though is to add a kind of base to my drawing. I'll show you what I mean. So going back to the layers, I've got my new sketch layer there. I've got the original scan, which I don't need anymore. But if I go to that and create a new layer above it, so that's below that sketch layer. I probably should name these layers, but it's not going to be a very complex drawing, so I'm not going to bother because I think it'd be quite obvious which is which layer to me. And then I'm just going to pick a colour at random. It doesn't matter what this colour is, I just need something that will contrast with the white of the background, and so usually I just pick a colour that appeals to me that I perhaps wouldn't ordinarily use. It's a chance to give it an outing. And then I'm going to use this studio pen brush. Now that is in the, what's it in? It's in the inking set that comes with Procreate, but I have all my favourite brushes here in a little folder that I've created so that I can quickly find them. So studio pen. And the reason we're going to use this pen is because it's pressure sensitive, so if I press lightly, I get a much thinner line than when I apply some pressure. And so you'll see how that means I can create the shapes I want without having to constantly adjust the sizes of the brush. And all I'm going to do is go around and create another outline of the dog. So I'm just working around the sketch that I've just made. And the other reason for using the studio pen to do this is because it's a solid brush, it doesn't have any texture to it. And when I do this, I need to make sure that this line is unbroken. So, for example, as I'm sort of filling out these hairs here, this isn't going to work because you can see that there's gaps in between those strokes. Even though they're only a couple of pixels wide, that is enough to make this not work. So I need to take the time to make sure I've got an unbroken line here. Now, could do this bit with the selection tool and just go around the outline and make the shape that you want. But I think doing it with the brush allows you much more control over how you make this shape, how detailed it can be. For example, here, it can really go in and pick up all those little hair textures there, which would be really difficult to do with the selection tool. So now that I've zoomed in here, I can see how messy the line work on this foot is. I probably will change that later on, but I try not to be too precious about those lines and little details like that. For one thing, this is massively zoomed in. The picture, you know, this is an A4 page, so that's not much bigger than the screen size of the iPad Pro that I'm working on. So a lot of these details you're never going to see. But also I think it's quite important to keep the sort of imperfections in the drawing. That's what makes it, I don't know, a sort of human-made piece of art, and it's what gives it character, it's what makes it yours. So it's really hard. I always find myself wanting to zoom in way too much and adjust every little line and make every little line perfect, and I have to sort of consciously fight that urge and try and allow a little bit of sloppiness in there. Okay, there's the line, the outline, finished, and then we hit the little colour up here in the corner and drag it over to fill that. And the fact that it's filled the dog and not the page means that there were no gaps showing. If I just undo that and create a tiny little gap, when you come to fill it, it will fill the whole page. And if you find that's happening, the best thing to do is just isolate areas. So here, I've isolated the head, the colours filled the head, I know that's not the problem. That's filling fine, and so I know the problem must be here in this area, and I can just go round the outline again and check for the gaps that way. Okay, but I don't actually want it to be red, I need it to be white, and the only reason I didn't do it white in the first place is because I needed it to contrast with the background. So now that's done, again, just drop the white colour in, and I've created this silhouette of the dog, and that's just a kind of, it's a kind of background anchoring point that everything else that we create will sit on top of. And whatever way I choose to colour my drawings, I usually start by doing this to each of the individual elements or characters within the drawing, because it's just really useful to have that base layer to help edit everything else. Okay, I'm not going to paint this dog, I don't think. I think I'm going to add an image to add some texture. So I've got a folder here on my iPad called Collage. And you can see I've got lots of different paint textures that were created specifically for using in Procreate like this. Some scribbly textures, some patterns, there's scans of papers and fabrics and a marble table in there. There's all kinds of different interesting textures and things. And here we're getting to some handmade papers, which is what I'm looking for, and I want this pink one. So if I just zoom in, you can see that this paper has lots of little fibres in it, like little woolly strands or something. And while it's subtle, it does add a nice kind of fuzzy, furry texture to the dog. So I'm just moving this around and adjusting the size until it covers every part of the dog. And then going to that layer, I'm going to select clipping mask, and that means that it will only show on that silhouette that we made earlier. Whatever's going on outside of that silhouette you can't see. So zooming in, it's given a sort of little bit more of an interest to the texture of the dog, but obviously I don't want it to be pink, so I need to change the colour of it. Now I could do that up here in the adjustments menu using either hue, saturation and brightness, or the colour balance options. But I want this dog, it's a yellow Labrador, so I want a nice sort of creamy yellowy colour, and I don't know the science behind it, but yellow is a hard colour to try and shift towards. If you're starting with another colour and you want to make it yellow, that's more difficult than other colours to reach. So I'm going to try something different instead. I'm going to select something, maybe this creamy colour here, something that is approximately the colour I want, and I'm just going to drop it onto that paper and see what happens. That's better, that's more of a creamy yellow. And now if I go into hue, saturation and brightness, I can make further adjustments. Okay, that's not too bad. Now if I go into the layers menu here and selecting that white silhouette we made, if I just drop that same cream colour into the silhouette, you can see the difference. So this is like a flat fill, and then if I toggle on the paper texture, it's a textured fill, and it's a subtle difference, but it does make a difference. This is much more interesting to look at to me than just the flat fill. Okay, you need both of these switched on, by the way, in order to see that top layer, because it's set as a clipping mask to the silhouette, so if the silhouette isn't visible, you won't see anything that's clipped to it. So make sure they're both turned on as visible. And what I want to do now is add a little bit more variation to the colour, just add areas of interest. So another layer above the paper layer, and set that to clipping mask as well. And then I'm going to select a similar but slightly darker colour, and I'm going to add some sort of painterly textures, paint stains, to this scanned in paper. Now I'm using the Aquareal set of brushes by Lisa Glanz, which is a watercolour brush pack, and it's really lovely. It's one of my favourite sets of brushes I've ever bought. But these paint stamps that I'm using, they're quite easy to make your own. I'm going to make a YouTube video soon about how to do that. And then I'm just going to add these to my dog, and I'm just kind of experimenting with the placement and the size and opacity of these stains. You can see they make quite nice, interesting watercolour textures to it. I don't want to use the same brush all the time, I want to mix it up a little bit. And this is a lot of trial and error, so sometimes I'll go in and I'll make a mark, delete it, try again. This one looks interesting. It's got lots of texture, but it might be a bit much because it's got quite harsh outlines. Let's try this one. I think that's too much. It's a really faint one. That's a really nice shape. It's just working out exactly where it looks best. I think the look I'm trying to go for is as if some little bits of paint have splashed on this paper. Without it being too harsh. Okay, that kind of works. I'm just going to, using another watercolour brush from this pack, I'm just going to use it as an eraser and just soften a little bit of those. Okay, that's not bad. What I'd like to do is add a darker element to the ears, because quite often with Labradors the ears are darker than the rest of the fur. I'm going to do this on a new layer, and again, that's a tractor going past, in case you hear that. Set that new layer to clipping mask as well, and the reason I'm doing it on a new layer is just that if it goes horribly wrong, and I don't like the way it looks, I can just delete that without ruining what I've already done. That's way too big. Let's try a different brush. So again, I'm just doing this by building up textures using the stamp. And in both these stamp layers, I'm going to set them to multiply so that you see the paper from below. Okay, so that's added the darkness that I want to the ear, but I don't want it in all this other area around the ear. So let's select the right brush. Let's use a pencil brush. Nope, let's use a studio pen. So what I'm doing now is just deleting from the area around the ear so that that darker colour is only on the ear. And applying it with the stamp brushes gave me a much sort of softer, more interesting shape to that area of darker colour than if I'd just sort of drawn it in with a brush. But what you're seeing is some texture from the layer below that. Now here at the top of the ear there's a very definite line from the edge of that stamp brush which is a little too straight, so I'm going to select a textured watercolour brush as an eraser and just go in and break down that harsh edge like that. Okay, I think that works quite well. If that's too dark, we can just go into the layer and reduce the opacity until we find a level that works. Okay, and I'm happy with that, so I'm going to merge it down to join the layer below, because just keeping the number of layers to a minimum keeps the whole process much more simple. That said, another layer above it, set again to clipping mask, and I want a sort of pinky colour. And I'm going to use a pencil brush, a graphite sort of shader, just to add some pink to her tummy. So this is where her fur would be thinner. You might see her skin below. But it also just adds a little bit of interest, a little bit more variation to a dog that would otherwise be one uniform colour, which makes for a less interesting picture. And I think I'll put a bit of this around her muzzle as well, just around her nose. And the thing with working in layers in this way is, as I go along, if I decide there's any elements that I don't like, I can just change them. Okay, that's looking quite good. Let's sort out her features. So I'm going to make a new layer again. We need to make her eyes white, and for that I'm going to go back to the studio pen because it's a nice solid pen. So we've added white to the eyes, and what colour would her nose be? Brown, I guess? Pinky brown? And I think I will use a watercolour brush, just because the studio pen brush would be too solid, too harsh. I want something a little softer. That's better. And then going back to white and a pencil, I'll add a little bit of shine to that wet nose. I'm using the pencil tilted on its edge here, so it's got that nice toothy texture to it. It's a bit too much. I'll just go in and delete some of that. Oops. Oh yeah, didn't do it on a separate layer. Just go back and erase and do that bit again. Okay, she's looking quite good already. I say that now, I'll hate it when it's finished. I won't be happy with it at all. and I'll be questioning all my life choices and whether I should be using Procreate or watercolours or oil paints, and just entering some kind of existential art crisis. Okay, let's put some floor underneath her to ground her. What would be a nice colour? I think we want something neutral for now. We can always change these colours later on. And I'm going to use Artist Crayon, which is in the sketching pack in Procreate. And this layer needs to be underneath that silhouette base layer. So a new layer. Oh, that's too big. And I'm just adding some really rough suggestion of shadow or floor underneath the dog. And what I'm doing is making it a little bit darker in the areas where her body meets the floor. So like underneath her feet, underneath her belly there. That would be a darker shadow. And then dragging it out until it fades out. It's not straight. If you look at it, it's slanting off towards the left. It's slanting downwards. So I'm actually going to start again. Here's a good tip. If you have a layer and everything on it needs erasing because you want to start again, rather than pressing 2 fingers delete repeatedly, you can put all 3 fingers on the canvas and sort of swirl them around as if you were beating an egg or something with your fingers, and it will delete everything that's on that layer but keep the layer. So that's quite a good way to start again. I really like this Artist Crayon brush for this because it's got a lovely rough texture to it. Adjusting the canvas to this orientation makes it much easier to get these straight strokes coming straight down. But that's a bit too much. So let's go in with the same brush and knock some of that back and just put a bit more texture in there. I don't know, I've ended up erasing most of it. Okay, I'm going back and forth a lot there, but I think it's much better to get the shape and the texture right to begin with. Things like the exact colour and the darkness of the layer and things like that can always be changed afterwards, but it's much more difficult to make adjustments to the texture or the overall shape that you've laid down. So to begin with, focus on getting that bit right. Just darken up under her feet a little bit. Okay, that'll do. Let's add some other elements to the picture. Let's add some balls because the text was about the dog's balls in a sort of roundabout way. So I'm going back to that grey colour that I used for the outline, and I'll go back to the 6B pencil again. And I'm just going to try and draw some ball shapes. And I'm using this tool up here, so if you draw a roughly circular shape without taking your brush or pencil off the page, you have this option up here that says ellipse, and you can change that to a circle and it will create a perfect circular shape for you. I think maybe you need to come out of that and then adjust the size with the usual adjustment tool. So So I'm going to add a couple of balls, and I'm going to draw each one on a separate layer for now, because that will allow me to alter the size of them individually. And then I can go back in and merge those layers. How many do we want? Lots of balls? 3? I'm very much making this up as I go along, which is pretty much how I normally work. Just test things out and see how they go. 4. As a rule of thumb, it's quite good to have odd numbers in compositions, and I've got 4 balls there, but if I count the dog as an object, then I've got 5 objects, which is an odd number, and so I think that works. I could, if I wanted to, add another sort of big ball there, but it would distract from the dog. I think I quite like that kind of tailing off like that. So let's merge these 4 layers with the balls on. And I'm going to just use the, what am I going to use? The Studio Pen again as an eraser, just to rub out the lines that I don't need because they're where the balls are overlapping. I'm just going to make that a bit lighter. Okay, and then I need to do exactly the same thing as I did with the dog, and that is to create a base layer. And that is especially because I've got this background underneath the balls. Sorry, let's just pick a different colour. And I don't want that to show through. And the best way to deal with that is to just create a white base layer, and then I can add whatever I want over the top of that, whether I choose to colour the balls in with a brush or I add more paper textures like I did with the dog. You see I'm zooming in a lot and moving my canvas around a lot as I work. I know that some people find that quite annoying, like they don't like to work that way, but this is how I work even if I were using real paper and paints or pencil. I'm not one of those people that will tape down my paper onto a board and work at a drawing from the same orientation for the whole process. I'm always moving the page around to get the right direction for the strokes that I'm making. Okay, so we filled those, and again we just have to make that white. Okay. Now I've made no decisions beforehand about a colour scheme for this picture. I don't want to add too many colours in, but I think we do need a bit more than just the yellow and the purpley grey that we've got at the moment. So again, this is a lot of trial and error here as I just chuck some colours in and see what happens. I've just realised I'm on the wrong layer. I need to add another layer above that base layer so that I've got the base layer intact. That's better. Let's see if we've got any paper scans that could add a nice texture to one of the balls. or a nice pattern. One of these could work. Now I don't want it across all those balls like that, I just want one, so I'm going to use the selection tool to select the ball I want, copy and paste, and then I can get rid of that layer and again set that one to clipping mask, and it's just applied it to that ball. And then going up here to hue, saturation and brightness, I can sort of tweak these colours until I get something that is more sympathetic to the image overall. Does that work? I think I might leave it like that. I'm doing each of these balls on a different layer at the moment, just again so that if I want to make any changes, I can do that. Let's select a colour that is already in the image from here. And let's look for a different texture brush just to add a bit of variety. That's quite a cool brush. The more you press down, the more white appears. If you press lightly, you get a darker colour. That's nice. I think that worked really well for the ball because it added a sort of natural highlight to it. Okay, let's merge all these balls now that we're done, and then using white and a pencil brush, let's add some highlights. I'm using the pencil brush rather than something softer like an airbrush, which is really good for adding highlights to things, just because I want it to have a sort of more hand-drawn element to it. Like if this were a physical picture, if I were using like real watercolours or bits of collage paper and stuff, then I would probably use a white pencil crayon to create the highlights, and so that's why I'm going with white here. Why I'm going with pencil crayon here. Okay, I was going to make that largest ball look like a football with the sort of football pentagon. How do you draw a pentagon? Shapes to it, but well, first of all, I can't think what a football looks like how those shapes tessellate together. And also I think maybe I quite like it just left alone like that. Might leave it like that for now. Now looking at the image, I think that floor, that bit, is the wrong colour now, so I'm going to just use the hue, saturation and brightness to just shift that slider along and see if I can get a nicer colour. And I'm just doing this by eye, not like I don't know what I'm going for, I'll just know it when I see it. So maybe like that, just leaning more towards the blue. Okay, let's have a look at the picture overall and see how balanced it looks. I mean, it doesn't look like much right now. I'm hoping it's all going to come together at the end. What I'm going to do now is add, not there, let's add it at the top. Add another image, and this is just a scan of some paper. It's if I zoom in, you can see it's got a slight sort of rough texture to it, but it's not as heavily textured as say a cold pressed watercolour paper. So it should add just a subtle paper texture to the image. So I've put it above all the other layers, and I'm going to set it to multiply so that you can see the other layers through it. And what it does is it adds that texture to everything below. That's it switched off, that's it switched on. So it's very subtle, but I think it does help. I was going to say take away from the digital look, but it's still a very digital looking drawing. It just adds something to it. Okay, I think that's the colouring part done. So what I'm going to do is select all these layers by tapping on them and swiping right. But all the ones with colour, I've selected them and I'm going to group them, and then I can just reduce that group like that. So it just makes this whole layers panel a little bit more manageable. And then all I have to do is add in all the detail. So I'm going to use that same dark grey that I used for the outline. And for this part, I usually use a combination of the 6B pencil when I want a finer, darker detail, and then I'll use a combination of other pencils that I have, that I've collected from various sets, to add sort of softer or paler pencil lines and textures. Lisa Glanz has a lovely pencil, like graphite pencil brush pack called Plush Pencil. That's got lots of sort of crosshatch and stippling, shading, pencil effects in there. Lucy Fleming also makes a really nice pencil brush pack, and there are some good pencil options native to Procreate as well. So I'll probably mix it up using a combination of the 6B and any one of these paler, harder pencils to add the details now on this layer. But let's start with 6B. And I'm going to make it a little bit larger than I did when I made the initial outline. And actually at this point, I think I'm going to reduce that initial line work in opacity and start again on this layer above. Sometimes I don't do that. Sometimes I will keep that initial layer as part of my final drawing. But here I think it's just going to be easier if I start again and keep all the line work on one layer. I'm just zooming in and out all the time to see how it looks when you see the image as a whole. Are those brush strokes too broad? Do I want to make them narrower? Is it working overall? But I'm zooming in so that I can see the details of where I'm drawing. So that's the 6B pencil. And then I'll use one of these softer pencils to go in and add more detail as if I were shading with real graphite. Oh, do you know what? I've just had a thought. Let's go back to the colours, and above all the other colours that we laid down, so above that pink on the belly, which was the top one, again set to clipping mask, I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to use, let's select one of the colours from the image, one of the darker colours. I'm going to use a watercolour brush, and I don't know if this is going to work. I'm sort of making it up as I go along now, but I'm just thinking about where the shadows would be on the dog, and I'm just drawing those in. So under these rolls there might be some darker areas, under her chin here. This would be in shadow. And I know it looks really bad right now, but this isn't finished. I'm going to adjust it. So here in the fold of this ear, there'd be a shadow under her armpit there. Where else? This foot. Definitely be shadow here, but I don't know whether that's going to work because of the pink of her belly. Okay, that will do. Now I'm going to set that layer to multiply so that you see all the marks from underneath it, and I'm just going to, actually before I reduce the opacity, I'm going to go in with the eraser, set to a nice textured watercolour brush, and I'm going to soften those lines, soften the edges of the lines so that they sort of blend out a little bit more. And it still looks terrible, but I'm still not done. Here on the ear, the line from under the ear, the shadow under the ear has overlapped onto the ear, so I'm using the Studio Pen eraser to knock that out, because it's got that sort of straighter edge to it, and then back to the watercolour eraser for the softer edge. I guess I could have just used a softer edge brush to begin with to put the lines down, but I didn't, so I'm doing it this way. I'm not sure about these bits under her belly. I might end up erasing those completely. Now that I've softened up those edges, I'll go into that layer and reduce the opacity right down so that it's really subtle. In fact, if we remove it completely and then bring it up slowly, find the threshold where it adds something without being overpowering, which is about there. So again, it's really subtle, but if I knock it off and on again, you can see the difference it makes. I think I just need to reduce it a little bit around that fold, around her shoulders, and maybe on the knee there. But I think that helps. Okay, now that that's done, we can go back to that dark colour and back to adding the line work, the pencil effects. And this part of the drawing process is the most time consuming. I have a tendency of zooming in too much, putting in too much detail, and then zooming out and erasing it, and then going back in and doing it again. And I really need to break that habit, but I can't. That's just the way I work digitally. I also could save time by using the pencil tilted on its side to get more of a broader, shady brush like that, but again, I don't. I tend to use it on its point and repeatedly go over the lines to build up the colour instead. So this is going to take me a while. We'll also say that right now these colours appear really dark, and I might go in and change that at the end, but I work in this darker colour because it can always be lightened, but it makes it clearer to see what it is I'm doing if I start with it dark. And sometimes it works, sometimes it looks good like that. Okay, so I'm going to carry on with this. There's no point me sharing the whole screen recording of me doing this because it would be very boring. This part does take a long time, and it's basically just doing the same thing over and over again. I'm just going around the dog. I'm building up the line work with those little short strokes that look like hairs, combining that with shading in areas that would be in more shadow or where we need to suggest a three-dimensionality to the shape. So I'm going to crack on with that, and I'll speed this bit up for you. Well, I think that's the shading element finished. You can see how quickly adding the process of adding the colour to the image was compared to adding all the shading, which is what really took time. But it's sort of relaxing time. By that point in the illustration, all the decisions have been made. I'm not having to think about colours or composition or whether the lines are right. It's just a case of getting your head down and doing all that shading. And I always put some good music on and stuff while I'm doing that. Actually, I was listening to Belle and Sebastian, which I didn't realise at first was really fitting because the dog in this story is called Belle. In Procreate, if you go to the little spanner icon up here, is it a spanner? A wrench? What are they called? The little tool icon up there, and go to Canvas, and then Canvas information at the bottom there, and statistics. it will give you lots of information about your artwork. So the total number of strokes I made so far, 3,948, and it's taken me 2 hours and 7 minutes to do this drawing. And as I said, most of that was adding those lines. So it's nearly finished. I keep seeing bits I want to touch up. But there is just one thing that I do want to do, and that is adjust how heavy that line work is. So on the line work layer, tap on that layer. Nope, tap on the little N on that layer, and you have this slider for opacity, and we can bring that up or down. So this is it at full opacity, and I think it's just a little bit too black. So if I slide that down, I like to go too far and then bring it back up. Around there, it's just softened it somewhat, and I like that, but because that's softened the line work overall, I can see a couple of places where I think it needs to be a touch darker, so I'm just going to add another layer above and just add just the slightest little hints of darker line work back in just a few places. So I'm going under the feet here, where they meet the ground, where there's shadow, and under the belly, so really the very darkest parts in this sort of area of the knee. Just anywhere that needs a little bit of definition. It's a case of zooming in and out to see the detail and then see the bigger picture too. Just to make sure that overall the image is balanced. Okay, I think that's it. I think it's finished. I don't know how I feel about it at the moment. I never do. I always have to sort of step away from my drawings for a day or whatever, and then look at them again with fresh eyes to see whether I like them or not. At the moment, I don't really like anything that I draw. When I work in Procreate, I always find myself thinking, oh, I should just work in graphite. Graphite's better. And then I want to work in watercolour. And if I work in watercolour, I want to work in Procreate. And if I do work in Procreate, you know, there are a million different things you can do in Procreate. So there's always these decisions swimming around my head. So I don't know whether this will be the final illustration that illustrates the post. By the time you see this, that post will already be up, so you will know. But there we go. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions about the process, drop me a comment. Bye for now.